This is part 2 of literary criticism. Today we are going to focus on how to read criticism, and we are going to look at a couple of examples of critical articles so that you can see what they're going to look like as you begin your research. So the first thing that you need to do is find the author's main argument. That sounds like a pretty simple thing to approach, but sometimes these are very long first paragraphs, or sometimes you're not going to find the author's main argument until you get through the entire first section of the article. So we're going to look at that and kind of help you find where you might locate it. What gets in the way is the literary review section. Literary review is something that all academic articles do. The purpose of the lit review section is to discuss what has already been said about the topic, because an article that gets published has to have something new to say. The article has to approach the subject in a new direction or from a new lens or angle, and it has to contribute something to the scholarship of that topic. This is not just for literary criticism. This is for any topic that you study, whether it's history, science, math, whatever. Lit review is important because it shows that you've already done your homework, basically. It shows that the critic has looked into what have scholars already said and where does my argument fit within this existing argument about the piece that I am approaching. And so sometimes this lit review section is really long, and I want to let you know that you should just skim that lit review section. You do kind of need to pay attention to it enough that you'll know when it's over, basically. There are going to be a lot of names in this section because basically the writer of the article you are reading is going through all the other people who've said something about that piece. And you need to pay attention to some key words that are going to let you know whether your article's author agrees or disagrees with these other critics. Sometimes they will begin by saying, this subject has been covered by these 3 critics, and they have been misguided in this way. So they'll say, these people were looking at the wrong thing. These people did not have a full grasp of what was going on in this work. And so they'll introduce critics in order to shut them down or point out their flaws and argue against them. Sometimes, though, they bring in arguments that they're going to build upon. So they'll say, this person has already identified these elements, and then this person pointed out these things. I'm going to build on that and go a step further by saying this. And so sometimes they bring in works in order to show the direction they are going with their argument and how they're going to contribute to an existing field. So you'll pay attention for words that show agreement or disagreement in that lit review section. After the lit review section, which does usually occur near the beginning of the article, some, as you will see, jump right in with it. After all of that, after they've established what's already been said, the author will begin to build their own argument. And so they will state what they are particularly contributing, and there usually is a clear sentence or 2 thesis. And they will then support that argument with the text. And so they'll move away from including a bunch of other critics' names and begin to include evidence from the text itself. You might occasionally still see a name pop up when they are using that name to support their argument or directly targeting a critic that they disagree with. But for the most part, you'll begin to see quotes from the literary work itself that support the author's piece. And that's the main thing that you're going to be doing, finding the argument and how does the author support the argument. But I want you to go a step further and also think critically about the article you are reading. Argue with the text a little bit. Think about which points make sense and which ones don't. As the lit review shows you, there's not always agreement about how to interpret something in these literary pieces. So you may find that you agree more strongly with the writer of your article, or you may find you don't like their argument. Either one of those responses from you is a valid response. And So as you read, just kind of make notes out to the side if you're able to print it or mark on the text. And think about, mark like question mark. I'm not sure I agree with this, or right, but what about, you're leaving out this piece of evidence. On the contrary, you might also kind of have your mind blown by some of these things. You might think, well, I didn't notice that when I was reading, but now that this critic points it out, I totally see this character in a whole new way, or I see the significance of this scene in a way that I didn't before. And so you might, use an exclamation point, say, wow, that is a really good point. Stars and whatever kind of notes you like to use when you're reading. But so go beyond just summarizing and start to think critically in a way. We're going to begin by summarizing, but we're going to move toward that argumentative response as well. All right. So now that we've looked at how to read it, I want us to look at two examples together. The first example, we are just going to read the first paragraph of. These articles can be very, very long. It is not unusual for a literary or for an academic article to be 11, 12, 14 pages long. We're not going to start with those. Don't worry. We're going to start with ones that are much shorter and more approachable. This one is only 6 pages long, which makes it kind of on the shorter side of critical articles. But we're just going to read the introductory paragraph of this one so you can kind of see what these articles look like and how some of the pieces we just talked about show up in the articles. And then we're going to read an even shorter one together. So, first of all, the title of this article is Assembling the Ophelia Fragments, Gender, Genre, and Revenge in Hamlet. The author is Sarah Gates. It was published in Explorations in Renaissance Culture, which is an academic journal, and it was published in their winter 2008 edition. You will want to pay attention once we start researching to when an article was written. We want to look for recent interpretations. We don't want to be reaching back into the 60s, the 1960s, to find sources. Anyway, so this article is one that jumps right in with the Lit Review. The first sentence, in responding to Carol Thomas Neely's feminist modes of Shakespearean criticism, Elaine Showalter has analyzed the risks taken by feminist approaches to Ophelia. So right out of the gate, this writer mentions not one, but two other critics in the beginning. Now, that is not what I wanted to do. I wanted to highlight. It's not letting me highlight. That's weird. And so I'm going to highlight it green to be literary review. So Elaine Showalter, who is a pretty well-known critic, once you start to study a field, you'll start to recognize some names. But so I've read some of her stuff in grad school. Anyway, Elaine Showalter was responding to this other critic. And again, we can just kind of skim that part. We don't need to know who Carol Thomas Neely is. Don't get bogged down on that. In responding to this article, Elaine Showalter has analyzed the risks taken by a feminist approach to Ophelia. Quote, to liberate her, Ophelia, from the text, or to make her its tragic center, is to reappropriate her for our own ends. To dissolve her into a female symbolism of absence is to endorse our own marginality. To make her Hamlet's anima is to reduce her, or life force, is to reduce her to a metaphor of male experience. End quote. So this kind of summarizes Elaine Showalter's position about Ophelia and the problem with feminist approaches. This word indeed is one of those that I was saying you will become familiar with. This one shows agreement. So when she says indeed, we know that the writer of this article, Sarah Gates, agrees with Elaine Showalter. Indeed, feminist studies of Ophelia after Showalter have tended to read the other characters in the play as a set of victimizing circumstances against which she, Ophelia, must go mad to protest. And then these little numbers in parentheses are something writers will sometimes do to help you find their argument. It's not always there. Some finding in that madness, the piteous condition of the unmarried Elizabethan girl, and others making of her a silent hero who finds a powerful voice of critique. These are kind of the two different edges of Ophelia that we talked about when we were looking at the artwork. While many of these studies provide insight into the contribution she makes to the play as a different female voice that counterpoints Hamlet's tragedy, their treatments tend to, quoting Showalter again, reappropriate her for our own ends or reduce her to a metaphor of male experience. Now, this word while shows disagreement because you can tell there's going to be a contrast. While these studies do provide some insight, they tend to reappropriate her or reduce her. So really, this is all lit review. This is talking about what has been said about Ophelia in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight all of it green as lit review. Now the writer, Sarah Gates, is moving to or her own argument. And this is kind of transitionary period. Critics have very little of Ophelia, either on stage or in the words of other characters with which to work. In contrast to the carefully voiced and stage development of the hero, Hamlet, her role proceeds more in isolated fragments, receiving cautionary orders from a brother and father, giving a description of a rejected lover, being paraded as bait to catch the conscience of the hero, singing bits of old lauds, and drowning. Despite this rather piecemeal presentation, so she's just said there's not a whole lot to work with, and then gives a summary of like the 5 things Ophelia does in the play. Despite is also going to be showing contrast. Despite this rather piecemeal presentation, the play does supply enough clues in terms of genre conventions to suggest a cohesive trajectory that an audience versed in those conventions could easily discern. So she says, despite the fact that there's not much, there is enough. The conventions Ophelia's story suggests do not belong fully to the tragic form Hamlet is generally understood to follow, however, so that scholars whose interest is in genre have focused universally on the revenge plot and its male characters. Yet Ophelia's story is not only an enriching female version of the vengeful process engaged in by Hamlet, but also an enactment of a courtly love tragedy, an alternative dramatic form whose conventions supply its female protagonists a scope for tragic conflict and resonant action. Here we have the thesis statement for this piece. Ophelia is not only an enriching female version of Hamlet, but also. So this is where it says, here's one place they were correct, but also I'm going to add. Examining the Ophelia fragments, those few moments that Ophelia appears on stage in person or in the dialogue of other characters, clarifies how thoroughly she undergoes, in feminine form, not only Hamlet's struggle between the twin impulses toward murder and self-destruction, but also the ambiguous resolution of the conflict between what he calls in To Be or Not to Be, conscience or resolution, and opposing or suffering. Ophelia, in other words, takes an ambiguously achieved revenge, as does Hamlet, but from within the form that is most appropriate to her gender, the courtly love tragedy. So this just reiterates what she had said up where I highlighted Ophelia's story is not only an enriching female version of the revengeful process engaged in by Hamlet, but also an enactment of a courtly love tragedy. So we can expect now this article to explain what this courtly love tragedy is and how Ophelia fulfills it. So that is an opening paragraph of a critical article. You probably noticed a lot of complicated vocabulary in here. I would expect you to look up some of those words like anima, or perhaps you would need to look up you won't need to look up courtly love tragedy because hopefully the article is going to explain it. But anytime you come up against a word that you don't understand, please do look it up. There will be a lot of complicated vocab in these, but you will also begin to see similar phrasing in them. So you'll become familiar with it by the time you've read several of them. All right. So now this is a really complex example, and I wanted to actually start you there to show you what they are probably going to look like more often. But in order to break down how to summarize and discuss these articles, I want to look at a much shorter one. First, let's jump over here and look at summarizing a critical article. To summarize a critical article, you need to find the thesis and identify it in a couple of sentences. In her article, blank, you would include the entire title, Jane Doe argues, and then summarize it. You will summarize the main points being made in the article. There will be more than one main point. These are complex arguments that build on each other, and we will actually see kind of the line of reasoning that we are supposed to be using when we argue. And in summarizing those main points, you will also include the main pieces of text that the article uses, that the writer uses to argue that point. This final point here, that you need to draw a conclusion about the usefulness of the article, this is one sentence. At the very end of your paragraph, you will write one sentence that just says, ultimately, Jane Doe's article is an important criticism that adds something. You'll explain what it adds to the criticism of Hamlet. Or you might say, while there are kind of like the example in the article that we just read, while there are strong points in this, what the article overlooks is one sentence. That's all you're going to do there at the end. Everything else is just summary. All right. So now we are going to look at a much shorter article, and I'm going to show you how to go about looking at these. I know this is another long video. I'm sorry. So this one is called Hamlet Looking Backwards. It was written by Emma Smith, and this gives you an abstract. An abstract is something you will often find at the top, and when you are doing research, you will rely on the abstract to tell you whether or not you think this article will be helpful to you. This is a very short abstract. Emma Smith reads Hamlet as a play obsessed with retrospection, repetition, and the theater of the past. All right. Shakespeare's Hamlet is often seen as a text that looks forward, anticipating some of the psychological dilemmas of modern existence and its depiction of the young prince's morbid self-consciousness. Critics including Coleridge, Marx, and Freud have found in the play a key to their own understanding of the world, and directors throughout the 20th century have imagined a contemporary Hamlet dressed like David Tennant for the Royal Shakespeare Company in a beanie and a parka. What would you call this opening paragraph? What is the writer doing here? If you said lit review, you are correct. Alongside this proto-modernity, however, there's a good example of a contrast word. The play moves in a quite different direction, towards retrospection and the past. Like its hero, the play looks backwards. This is actually the thesis statement of this article. Very simply stated, Hamlet's own instincts are toward undoing rather than doing. In his opening scene, his agreement not to return to university fixes him in the role of a child, contrasted with Laertes, who is leaving his family for adventure in Paris. His obsession with his father's death is described as unmanly grief by Claudius, who reminds him pragmatically that nature's common theme is death of fathers. So after stating the thesis, this article then presents two primary pieces of text that are going to support that argument. No such progress for Hamlet, who is stuck physically and emotionally. He seems frozen. Man delights not me, he tells his old friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and adds in response to their smirks, no, nor woman neither. Hamlet's strongest affections are toward the dead, including his father and Yorick, rather than the living. It is only at Ophelia's funeral that he can acknowledge his love for her. Now, what I would write here if I was reading this, because I think that I would write, well, hang on. I just really want to get this Ophelia part. If I had a piece of paper, I would probably just put an exclamation point. But for a Google Doc like this, I'm just going to say, wow, good point, because I'd never thought about that element, that his strongest affections are toward the dead, and it is only at Ophelia's funeral that he can acknowledge his love for her. Boom, that point kind of blows my mind. All right, now the writer, who is Emma Smith, moves on to succession. Hamlet's personal situation reflects the political concerns of the period. For some reason the play never fully explains, the adult male heir does not inherit the throne from his father. The play is thus obliquely concerned with the great but unspeakable topical preoccupation of the end of the 16th century, the question of who would succeed the unmarried Queen Elizabeth. It was a crime to discuss the succession directly, but the theater was able to glance at it through parallel, and in this way Hamlet has close affinities with Shakespeare's plays on the English historical subjects which rehearse similar issues. My problem with this first point is that if Smith's point is that the play looks backwards, this point seems to say that it is looking at its own point. So I'm going to say that this is not a strong point. Because it doesn't seem to look backward to me. It looks at current issues going on in Shakespeare's day. Now, you should have already read this article, so I don't really feel like reading the entire article to you is a good use of our time here. I am now going to kind of hit the highlights of it. So if you have not already read it, please pause the video now and go back and read this article on your own. This next point, revenge and remembering, is stronger in the direction of the author's Smith's thesis that Hamlet looks backwards. It talks about mourning for a dead father, and it talks about that his demands on his son are made in the name of the past. I would say that that is a stronger point. And even just the word remember is kind of a strong point here for this section. This article being divided into sections is very helpful to you in your summary, because you could really go through and write a sentence of summary for each of these subdivided sections. Not every article will be so kind, but many of them are, because these are much longer articles, and the one that you are going to be doing for homework is divided into sections like this to help you out. The second one, the play as a forensic tool, makes some strong points. And so if you're not familiar with the term forensic, you would want to look that up. This casts Hamlet in the role of a detective, but what I think is the stronger point in this section is that it says it resembles an outdated type of play. And so this is a point I was unaware of. So if I'm reading this article and marking it, I would appreciate this writer's research into this to let me know that this was an older version of a play performance. I did not realize that. And then there is also a connection here with ideas of ancient Rome. That is a strong point. It then goes into looking at Catholicism and the Reformation. This is another point that is not as strong. This is a little weaker because, again, although it says that the Reformation was from the 16th century, that's not that long ago in Shakespeare's day. And it also kinds of connects it to modern England as well. So this is a weaker point, although I would say it's stronger than the beginning point. Here's another mention of the theatrical past. This one's more specific, and I also found this interesting. Shakespeare, as you may know, bases his plays on other works or on historical events. And so this in particular brings up a play, Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, and it says that Hamlet was based on this particular play, and it compares and contrasts it to it, saying that Thomas Kyd's play was a blockbuster hit. And so, really, as it says down here, like Hamlet the Prince, we might say Hamlet the play is haunted by a more successful predecessor. I really just want to say here that that is nicely phrased. I like the parallelism of that statement. And then it ends with the observation of the skull. It's no wonder then that this haunted and retrospective play has been distilled into one image, Hamlet face to face with the skull. And that this skull is a memory of a specific reminder of the past, not just, oh, people die, but specific people die. Now the paper moves to its conclusion. In Shakespeare's characterization of Hamlet, to produce a play that looks backward, theatrically, psychologically, structurally, and religiously. That's a sentence fragment. I'm not sure why it's there. Overshadowed by all these pasts, neither Hamlet nor Hamlet can make progress. Hamlet as a revenger is also Hamlet who must be revenged. Seeking retribution for his father's death, he kills another father and makes his own death a circular inevitability. Like its hero, the play loses its way in the structural fog of the trip to England, the pirates, and the preposterous figure of Osric. A work that has come to seem so modern and so contemporary ends when the play's many pasts catch up with it, and the price of their revenge is the foreshortened future. That is the conclusion of the thesis. That is, if you're looking for what the thesis is and you can't find it in the introduction, look in the conclusion. Gertrude's lament for the dead Ophelia, I had thought thy bride bed to have decked, sweet maid, and not have strewed thy grave, stands as a much more general elegy for a play where the burden of the past overcomes the hope of the future. Lots of good parallel structure in there to make the writer's point. And so then you would go back through and you would say, in her article, let me get to the top. Hamlet Looking Backwards. Ella Smith argues that Hamlet is a retrospective play rather than one of forward thinking. You would summarize the 2 or 3 key points. What you might do with this one is you might say Smith, oh, it's Emma, not Ella. Smith makes strong points about the concepts of revenge and remembering that link Hamlet to the past, and about how the murder of Gonzago and the play within a play is an outdated mode of theater that Shakespeare revives in this play. And weaker points, however, are made in discussing, what else did I say was weak? The religious elements of the play and the concept of succession, which seem to link the play more to Shakespeare's present day than his past. And you would say it with a bit more length than that. You would go into the text that she uses. And then ultimately you would decide, is this an important criticism or a misguided angle? So for this one, I might say that despite a few weaker points, Emma Smith contributes greatly to how Shakespeare is not just a forward-thinking play, but one that draws upon social and theatrical pasts. All right, so when you go to look at your homework, and this is on Teams, you should use these examples to help you write your summary of the other article that is linked here on Kiddom, the Gertrude article. It's a very interesting article that it does a lot with a character who has even less to go on than Ophelia in the article that we just read. So good luck with that. I will have office hours on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday if you need help writing it. It is not due until Monday, and I we'll know later this week what exactly next week is going to look like and how we are going to approach these.